Hi, everyone. The episode you're about to listen to was originally supposed to be episode 85, not episode 84. Unfortunately, I had something of an audio disaster that forced us to scrap episode 84. It's kind of a bummer. It was a really good episode. We may make the YouTube video of that available in the future so you guys can see what could have been. But for now, just know that this was originally intended to be episode 85. That's why in the episode I refer to it as episode 85. And also, I don't introduce Kate because I thought I had an episode before this one to introduce Kate. And so I'll just do that now. We are being joined on the Gauntlet podcast by a new regular host. That's Kate Bullock. Kate is the organizer of Toronto area gamers as well as the Breakout Con convention, and she writes an excellent blog called Blue Stockings Organic Gaming, which can be found at bluestockings.ca. So if you see Kate around the G Plus or on Slack or wherever, say hi and enjoy the show. It's a really great episode featuring myself, Kate, and Stephen Dewey talking about emotional play. Thanks. This is episode 85 of the Gauntlet podcast. My name is Jason.
I'm Stephen.
And I'm Kate.
Stephen, thanks so much for being on the show.
Not a problem. Thank you for having me.
Listeners, that is Stephen Dewey from Cavalry Games. You guys will probably know him from his excellent candle-based horror game, 10 Candles, which I have not yet played. I am presently waiting on Stephen to create an online version of 10 Candles where instead of candles, everyone's monitors become dimmer and dimmer as you play.
Oh.
It's kind of a good idea, right? I saw you shaking your head,
that.
Kate. Yeah. But no, I'm kidding.
It will happen someday.
But Stephen, thanks for coming. This is going to be great.
Thank you for having me.
So listeners, we are doing something kind of special this week. This is going to be an ongoing series of kind of like a topic-focused roundtable, and I've asked Kate to prepare a topic for these, and we're going to be inviting guests on to kind of explore the topic. But before we dive into that, Kate, I gather you have a very interesting exercise for us to engage in.
Well, hopefully it's interesting. I get a lot of people talking to me about emotional gaming, mostly because I suspect of my blog, because I talk a lot about emotions in gaming, it turns out. And I really love the Gauntlet for having Giving Me Life. I think Giving Me Life is a fabulous segment. Everyone really likes it. And of course, we're going to talk about that too. But I really want to talk about what we've been feeling emotionally in gaming lately. So my question for everyone is, what kind of bleed have you been having lately? For people...
You better define bleed, in case somebody doesn't know what that is.
So for those of you who aren't familiar with the term bleed, I believe it was coined by Emily Carabas, but it does mean the emotions you're feeling from your character kind of bleed into your real life and you kind of walk away from the table with them, or you're sitting at the table with them. So the question is more so, what emotions have you been feeling in games lately, or specifically, what have you been feeling the most, and how are you dealing with that?
Awesome, cool. So who wants to answer the question first? Who should answer first?
Well, you don't have anything written in your segment, Jason.
No, I did not. That's true. Yeah, I did. Yeah, everyone else did notes, listeners. I did not. I just, I'm just sitting down totally cold. I will go first though, because mine's probably more of a downer than your guys. So we'll lead with that. It's a super interesting question, and I had to think about it a little bit because, I mostly play like kind of up-tempo sort of adventure-y sort of games. That's probably the bulk of my gaming, right? But I actually did have a really interesting incident about a month ago that really kind of hit me in the feels, which was, something that a lot of people know about me, it's something I've written about before, is that when I was in the 4th grade, I was really badly bullied, like really, really severely bullied, to the point where I credit role-playing games with actually saving my life, because I was young and like in the throes of a despair that just was crushing, right? So anyway, that was almost 30 years ago, and every now and then I think about it. It's something that's kind of always there, but we had a situation in a game where an NPC was showing a lot of resentment towards one of the player characters, and it was a little unclear why that was happening, right? And so in play, we began to explore like what was the cause of this NPC's resentment toward this character, and it turned out to be that character reminded the NPC of of someone who had treated them badly when they were a kid, right? Like of some bullying they had experienced as a kid. And that all just kind of happened kind of organically in play. Like no one had that planned out. It just sort of happened as we were kind of having the discussion at the table. And when it was over, I was really like, oh man, I was feeling it, like I felt it, like it, I had all those bad feelings, they just don't ever, they don't ever go away, even after 30 years, like those sorts of, that trauma that you experience as a kid when other kids are being assholes never really quite goes away. And so I guess that was my most recent bleed. But at the end, I was kind of happy about it because I always like to be reminded of stuff like that because it makes me like happy and grateful for the sort of things I've put in place in my life to help cope with it, So, yeah, that's mine.
Well, thank you for being vulnerable. That was very, very open.
Yeah. You bring it out in me, Kate. What can I say?
I try. Mine is not a downer, so I'm going to go next, and then we'll talk to Stephen about how he's been feeling in games lately. I've been playing a lot of really, I would say, empowered characters recently. So I've been playing a shield maiden. I have a couple Valkyries on the go because apparently I just can't get enough of Norse myth. But all in all, because they're very assertive and like know their place kind of women, and not in a way that's like I belong in the kitchen, in a way that's like I belong with a sword in my hand. It's been really empowering because I've been writing this character who's really abused, which resonates with me on a whole other level. But playing women who are like badass, who are gonna like seriously fuck you up if you piss her off. That's been really, really it builds my confidence. I walk away from the table and I'm like, fuck yeah, I got this. Nice. So very different from where you're coming from, but very much how I've been feeling with just a few games I've played since New Year's. Stephen, how have you been feeling with your games lately?
Sure. So I don't spend a ton of time actually playing games as much. Usually if I'm sitting down around a table, I'm typically running the game rather than being a player in the game. But pretty recently, I did get a chance to kind of surprisingly sit down around a table and played characters quite a bit over a short period of time. And a lot of the bleed that I got there, or I guess I should say a lot of the emotion or the build-up for those characters, was that they solved problems. I naturally, in the real world, love riddles and puzzles. I like figuring out around a table, I like figuring out secrets or getting a bead on where things are going, trying to get an idea of what the overarching goals or plots or mysteries might be. I enjoy that a lot because it's sort of a mental workout for me, and I have this recurring cycle of frustration and then relief, and then frustration, and then relief as I am encountered with more and more problems, but then actually get to solve them. And I like that a lot because in the real world, it's hard to sometimes get immediate solutions for a lot of problems. You can't really have a large subset of small puzzles that you can work through and resolve to get that aha moment, to get that joy of puzzling something out. But around a table, when you are interested in doing things like that and are presented with those sorts of issues or conflicts that you need to overcome, you can, or at least I've been able to recently, play these problem solvers, play these puzzle solvers, and I get a lot of enjoyment from that because I get that sort of repeating emotion of relief when each independent issue is solved or each puzzle is cracked wide open, and I can then have that cleverness rewarded with advantages or story benefits or moving the plot forward in interesting ways, and that's a genuinely exciting feeling to have. So around a table, that's usually what I've been getting into more recently in terms of bleed, even though usually when I'm running games, it's heavier emotions or darker emotions. I love just solving riddles, apparently.
So you like feeling smart.
I like feeling clever and being rewarded for that, and sometimes that cleverness doesn't work out, but when it does,
it's such a great feeling.
Yes, exactly.
You might be a closet OSR gamer. I'm just going to throw that out there because the dungeon always has a puzzle to solve, right? Like, you
it's
never
true.
know. Could be.
Very true. Very true.
Awesome. Cool. Well, why don't we go ahead and move on to the topic then? So, Kate, what are we talking about today?
Recently in the Gauntlet Hangouts, I had a couple people ask questions about, like, I would really like to know, how do I facilitate emotional gaming? How do I hold that space? How do I get my players rewarded for having emotions? And so we immediately, I know, Jason, you pointed it out to me. You're like, this is a great topic. We should do this.
Yeah, it is a good topic, right? I'm excited. I think it's going to be really cool because I do think it's something that people are interested in, you know.
I think the recent rise in emotional gaming also indicates people really want to have those experiences. And one of the reasons I really wanted you to come on, Stephen, is because I know with 10 Candles, like, that is a highly evocative, emotional game. When I played it with you at JiffyCon, like, I walked away so upset but fulfilled. And also when we played Gather, that was a very emotional game as well, which is one of your upcoming games. So I really wanted you on here because I know you like writing about games that are going to invoke specific emotions. I think you're usually aiming for something in particular.
Yeah, I have become increasingly fascinated with how mechanical design behind a game can invoke actual real-world emotion at the game table, and how you can sort of utilize those tools of mechanical emotion to standardize the sort of experience that you're going to get with players and GMs, regardless of if they have had a chance to play a game with the GM before, or if they've never met the GM and have no idea how the game is quote unquote meant to be played. They can still sort of use the tools and rely on the tools inherent in the game's design to invoke a lot of those emotions. So I'm definitely very interested in emotions in gaming, and an important part of games like that is having the ability to facilitate them around your table.
Absolutely. So we're going to kind of talk about what you can do before game, what you can do in-game, and some tools that you can pick up and use throughout your gaming experiences, whether as a GM or as a player. So, Jason, did you want to start us off with some of the things you've come up with, what to do before the game?
Yeah, so I think that at a very, very sort of basic, I call it like table stakes sort of level, you have to talk about like the tone that you're going for, right? I mean, this is a basic thing that you should be doing, even if you're not angling for like emotional play. You need to be having a conversation about what is the prevailing tone of the game going to be, so that no one's expectations are dashed and no one feels resentful about how things worked out at the table, right? So to me, that's like step one, but it's not the most like interesting or actionable step in terms of like getting to emotional play, I don't think. I think the more effective thing is something that I've been doing pretty consistently for probably the last 4 or 5 months of my gaming, which is actually a lot because I game a lot, right? I run a lot of games. But the last 4 or 5 months, I've been doing this thing where for an ongoing series, like let's say session 2, right? I'll kind of, present to the table this opportunity, like about maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes before we actually dive into the in-fiction play. I'll kind of like say, hey, let's talk about like what sorts of scene goals we might have for our characters, right? What sorts of interactions we think might be interesting, what sorts of things we'd like to follow up on from last session. Doesn't mean we're going to do those things. The dice of the gameplay might lead somewhere else, but I think it's helpful to have the conversation beforehand so that when an opportunity to have like a more intimate moment or a more sort of emotionally satisfying moment presents itself, everyone's kind of aware of it, right? And they can kind of help facilitate it as a group and make it happen. So can I give you guys an example of what I mean here?
For sure.
Yeah, please.
So recently, this was very recently actually, it's why it's my example, because I can't remember what happened in my games. I could barely remember what happened in the fiction of my games 2 months ago. But so very recently we had a situation. It was the second session. And in the first session during character creation, we had established that one of the characters had experienced this terrible atrocity. They were a survivor of this atrocity that resulted in their entire family and community being kind of slaughtered, right? And that's already pretty heavy, right? But we had established in that first session that another character was kind of functioning as that character's like stand-in parental figure, right? So the one who had experienced this terrible atrocity, they were younger, and we kind of said, okay, well, I think it'd be cool if my character was kind of like a parental figure, a stand-in, a mentor, that kind of thing. So in the second session, when we're having our conversation, this sort of like pre-game like conversation that I like to have lately, the one player of the younger character said, "Hey, I would love to have a scene at some point where our characters talk about my character's like feelings about that, right? Like I think it would be great if we had a scene along the lines of like me feeling my character like feeling really like upset about what happened, and maybe you stepping in and kind of like trying to console me or soothe me or counsel me, right?" And so everybody else was kind of like nodding, like, "Okay, yeah, that's interesting." And the player of the sort of like parental figure character was like, "Okay, yeah, that's I'm into that. We can kind of see what happens." So anyway, we just were playing as normal, and like it was almost like this. It was this like really cool moment where we had a bit of like fictional downtime, and someone at the table was like, "Oh shit, this would be a great opportunity for you guys to like kind of explore that theme that we were talking about in the beginning." And we did, and it was great. And what I loved about that moment, the scene was really good, but also I liked that because of that conversation we had beforehand, everybody at the table was invested in making sure that we could explore some of those issues, right, and explore some of that play. I think it's a pretty straightforward, easy thing to do, and I think it's something that can lead to really good results. Not even just necessarily for emotional play, but for just getting to really like satisfying character results,
Yeah, absolutely. I actually do that all the time with my Monster Hearts games, where everyone will come to the table and have a list of some scenes that they're interested in, which it changes because it's Monster Hearts and every episode and scene can be dramatically upsetting. But they come to the list with like, "This time I want to have a scene with you. I'm not sure what it's going to be about, but it's probably going to be about like how I think you're kind of a douche nugget." So I do that all the time with Monster Hearts or any game where there's high investment in emotional scenes, just because it gives everyone an idea of people's kind of like emotional agenda. So you're always making space for each other. Then you're always like, "Oh, I know you wanted to do this scene. Do you want to do that before I go punch his face?" Right.
Yeah. No, I think that's super smart. So like what you're saying is you guys have like it's like a written down thing, like a list of like things you'd like to do. Is that what you're saying?
I do personally, just because I have a horrible memory. So I will come with like one way to fuck with each player to the table. That's what I bring to Monster Hearts. I'm like, today my vampire is going to hypnotize you, and they're going to have sex with you, and they're going to break up with you. Right. Just ways to like screw with everybody and get those emotional scenes already. And as a result, my players have started coming to the table with that too, so that they can kind of be like, "I really want this." And stating that intention later, someone can be like, wait, I really wanted to do this thing, and everyone's like, "Right, of course." So it creates the space ahead of time for people to already be talking about the kind of scenes they want.
Yeah, and I think that's awesome. And I don't think it, like, there's a part of me that, like, we play lots of PBTA games, and there's a part of me that thinks, like, well, are we kind of contravening, like, play to find out what happens? But I don't think we are. Like, I don't think that's what's happening at all. I mean, maybe a little bit, but I think the trade-off is worth it,
I don't think you are, because you're setting the scene. You're like, "I want a scene with X and Y, and the premise is I'm going to blow shit up." How is that going to blow up, and how are they going to respond? That's what you're playing to find out.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's super cool.
I think one other sort of approach to somewhat similar results, but maybe with less talking ahead of time, something that I incorporate in a lot of my games is I'll just be upfront with my players and say, throughout this game or throughout the sessions we have, we're going to have a whole bunch of time for you to take advantage of opportunities, to have conversations with other characters. We're going to have these little downtime moments that I'm not going to be driving the plot forward. I'm going to ask each of you what you'd like to do with this time. So I invite them at the beginning of game, right from the start, to start thinking about what they might want to use that time with. And there's not really a strong discussion about it up front, but I do see people after maybe a battle or an intense emotional scene elsewhere or some piece of plot, people will take notes. And then when inevitably you get to that portion, everyone's sort of got an idea because they've been actively writing it down because it's been in their head. It's not a surprise to them when that part of the game comes along. They've already been doing some planning. And even just that little bit can get players thinking about what they might want to address, what conversations they might want to have. And then on the player side, it's just about keeping your eyes and ears open for something that might be an interesting theme down the road. And if you wind up coming to the end of your session and you haven't actually approached all of these points yet or all of these things that you wanted to do, then that could be something you talk about either at the end of the session or the beginning of the next one. Hey, I didn't get to these last session. Just so you know, I have some that I want to approach or deal with right off the bat today or later on. Even just mentioning it to players can make them proactively think about the sorts of scenes that they would want to have so that they can be prepared for those downtime moments whenever they happen.
That's super smart. And I'll tell you, I have this habit, it's a bad habit, where I don't really give my players homework, like official homework, like say, okay, let's be thinking about this or thinking about that, tell me what, I don't really do that like in a sort of formal way because I communicate with like 90% of my players like constantly on Slack, right? So I'm always like kind of in touch with like what they're thinking about their characters and they always want to tell me things, so I'm always like aware of it. But I kind of let down that like 1 out of 10 person who doesn't engage in those combos with me and maybe wasn't quite as prepared. So I think that's really smart. Like I think there's something to be said about always thinking about the conversation, like at every point in the game, which might be a nice segue to the next sort of like angle we're talking about here, right? Which is like, we've done the before game stuff, right, Kate? Is there anything else we're going to talk about that?
No, I think the next part we're probably going to go on to is like, what are we doing as facilitators and GMs during the game to promote emotional play? Because some people are going to be super interested in emotional play and some people aren't. But we're mostly angling here for people who are like, yeah, emotional play. What am I doing?
Right.
So for me, my big one is I ask questions like crazy. And I know that's a Powered by the Apocalypse agenda or the other thing that I've completely forgotten despite how many times I run these games.
It's a good practice. It's a good in any game, honestly. Yeah.
It is. But for me, instead of asking typical questions, which is always, what do you do? Something will happen in the fiction, often something with violence, because to me, violence is a really interesting conversation. But something will happen in the fiction, and I will look at my player who's now impacted by this and go, so, Donahue, how are you feeling now that your best friend just stabbed your lover? Like, what's going through your mind? How are you feeling about that? And I'll give them a moment, because a lot of this is giving space for them to sit there and like metabolize that thought and come back to me with an answer, because the feeling answer isn't something people are used to giving. They're used to giving the like, well, I'm going to go stab him back, or I'm going to go run away because he terrifies me. Right? Those are the actionable things, but I always ask, what are you feeling right now? How does your character feel?
I think that's really good. I when I'm running a game, I kind of get in this like zone, like I get in this like sort of like GM zone, and I'm pretty good about asking questions. I ask lots of questions, especially up front, like either in the session or in the series. I'd like to get those things on the table and then kind of work on them in between sessions. One thing I think that is really helpful and is really like something I've had to work on personally a lot is in the middle of the session, being willing to kind of let a scene breathe, is a big deal. I think like when I first came back to role-playing games, I was really like excited about role-playing games and really kind of like, just feeling so creative and sort of, feeling creatively powerful, right? Like I was really in this like, this like space where I just wanted to, just role play, and act and improv, and it's gonna be awesome. And I used to have like not a lot of patience for people who were not giving like as much, like I used to like have no patience for it. And I think that was bad because I think there were times when I could have, as a GM especially, I could have like kind of backed off. And even though like I'm not totally into this scene that's going on right now, like exactly, it feels a little like kind of flat and the dialogue's not going so great and it's a little slow. But I think maybe I've missed some opportunities in the past where, maybe letting those players kind of figure it out a little bit, right? Like kind of giving them the space to figure it out. Now, mind you, that's been, a number of years ago, but like that's something I find to be very helpful. Being willing as the GM to say, okay, I'm just going to step back for a minute and I'm going to let them do their thing and see how it goes. And I find that like maybe sometimes the scene is going a little like, it's a little awkward at first, and maybe, no one quite knows what to say or knows what to do. I can sometimes throw some questions in there to kind of prompt some thinking, get their creative juices flowing, kind of prod things on, but mostly just kind of stepping back. A lot of times at a certain point, the players, it'll all kind of click. And I realize, oh shit, the players have just been kind of feeling this out and feeling the scene out and kind of figuring out where they want it to go. And then it's great, right? Like, it just sometimes takes a minute. And I think that's really important. And it's something that I've like really been conscious of like lately, it's something that's really been on my mind.
It was a hard lesson for me as a GM to learn.
I intuit that you and I are very similar in a lot of ways, Kate. And
what?
Yeah, and like I know that, right? Like I know that. So it is. It's hard, yeah.
Yeah, there's been multiple times where people have been having this intense scene, but I feel like it's boring because nothing is happening.
Right.
And I used to insert myself and be like, all right, something's happening. And now I just I will piss off and stand back and I will look at my phone. I will do anything to not be present so that they feel like there's no one necessarily watching this really intense emotional moment. And I'll come back when they're like done, when they're not talking anymore or they're joking.
Right,
I find when they joke, that's the moment.
That's exactly right. When they've released the tension, right? Like that's when like, okay, this is done. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Steven?
No, I completely agree with letting a scene breathe, giving players a time to work their way emotionally through those moments. And I think that is something that is hard for a lot of DMs and GMs. And it's certainly something that, like you, Kate, I had to definitely struggle with a lot originally. I have distinct memories of my first sessions playtesting 10 Candles, for example, and there was this constant push for me to throw monsters and horror and what will the next evil thing be that's coming up for these players. And I realized that was one of the worst things I could do in that game, because what invoked those emotions of fear and what evoked those emotions of conflict and worry were allowing players to have that time, to have those discussions, to have those interpersonal conflicts. And sometimes that means a scene where people are just sort of sitting in stunned silence for a really long time. And those are really, really, really great moments. And I realized so much so that they were important that I put a whole gosh darn chapter about just sitting back and watching into the rulebook of 10 Candles for the GMs. Basically, I'm just straight out saying, don't feel rushed to push your characters into conflict. If they're having a conversation, just let them have that conversation. It's okay. You don't have to do anything there. They will let you know when they're ready to move forward. Players are exceptionally good at letting you know when they want something to happen. You don't need to push that forward.
I think that was really wise of you to put that advice in there because, if you just think about like where the hobby came from, right? Like for so long, like what it was like the GM is responsible for our fun, right? The GM is delivering entertainment to us, and I am reacting to this entertainment that the GM is giving me. And those are hard habits to break, right? I mean, they really are. They're tough habits to break. And I think it's good for people to be reminded of it for sure.
Now, this sort of segues a little into one of the points I wanted to talk about, because we've sort of been talking about just sort of letting players play, letting what would naturally come out from your players happen, and how effective that is. And one of the things that I was thinking about when I was thinking about our topic for tonight was also just sort of letting the game do its game thing and being knowledgeable as a GM of where already in the inherent rules of the game, there are emotional beats and there are emotional triggers and emotional points that will happen for your players completely independent of you as a GM. And if you're knowledgeable of that, because they're in every game, Every single possible game has mechanics that evoke emotion of some kind. Even if you're just rolling a d20 to see if you hit an orc, that is going to have an emotional outcome depending on if you're successful or not. So being aware of what those emotional beats are as a GM and sort of preparing for them, or at least being cognizant of what the fallout might be, is really important also to get a handle on how you're going to facilitate that emotional play, because you need to allow the game to have that breathing room and know when there may be problems or know when there might be opportunities to push certain emotional aspects, to push whether it's conflict between characters, or allow them to have those scenes based on what you know will be emotionally impactful beats of the game itself. So that's something that I've also been fascinated with because I'm interested in mechanical emotions. But just having a knowledge of that as a GM is a very powerful tool to help you with facilitating emotions.
Do you mind if I sort of, just for myself really, just kind of unpack that with an example that I just to see if this is what you're talking about?
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Like, I'm thinking of Dog Eat Dog. Are you guys familiar with Dog Eat Dog? Dog Eat Dog.
Yes.
The GM literally can't lose, right? Like, the GM basically gets to decide whether your role is successful or not. Like, you still roll, but the GM has all that power, right? And that feels a certain way, right? Like, I think when players first experience it at the table, it definitely evokes a certain emotion, right? It's a similar thing with My Life with Master, right? In the beginning, the GM is extremely powerful. It's almost impossible to defeat them at anything, right? Is that what you mean? Like, if I'm facilitating one of those games, knowing what those games are angling for, what the mechanics are going to deliver emotionally, and being able to respond to it?
Yeah, exactly. So Dog Eat Dog being a perfect example, right? You have, as the GM, an incredible amount of power to essentially shut down something that the player was trying to do. And there's a big difference from saying, okay, so you attempted to do this, but you fail. All right, onward to the next scene. And actually describing and taking a moment to say how they failed, and then pausing and waiting and allowing for that to be processed and allowing for that to be discussed at the table, to allow for that emotional impact, to facilitate a positive environment for that emotional impact to exist in, and sort of promoting that as a GM rather than shying away from it. So if you know that those moments are going to happen, you can take advantage of them better. You can approach them with more coherent storytelling and more room to allow those scenes to exist, to allow players to involve themselves emotionally, because you're aware of them and therefore won't skim past them or skip over them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think with looking at mechanics, especially in Powered by the Apocalypse games where moves are so specifically designed to invoke certain things, Night Witches comes to mind, where the whole game is just designed to make you feel like crap.
except when it's not, like, right? I mean, yeah. So I've only played it as a one-shot, I'll admit. But every time I walked away from that game, I'm like, insides, everything hurts. I've played it in a couple of full series, and it was my favorite game a couple years ago. I find that it's a game in multiple sessions. It's a game of peaks and valleys, right? Like, okay, half the squadron died last night, but now we're hanging out, having a drink on our downtime and kind of bonding and releasing. And, so it's got like, it's like The Watch, right? Like The Watch has a similar thing where like a big part of it is is sort of like the ups and downs, right? Like the sort of emotional highs and lows of the game. But I think your point still stands, right, Kate? I mean, it's the same.
Yeah. Well, you look at what they're trying to do. Which is partly finding the right system that fits, but I'd rather stay away from, let's suggest a bunch of emotional games that you can go play. Yeah. And how to facilitate in Dungeon World, how to be more emotional, right? And part of that, what we've been talking about, is a lot of giving space and allowing the players to really understand what they're feeling and making sure they have time to feel it. As opposed to being like, okay, well, you stabbed the orc and he's dead now. It doesn't matter. He has a family. It's cool, guys.
You both brought up the case of stabbing the orc, and that's super interesting to me because I don't think I have ever asked my players to consider like whether that orc had a family or not. Right? Like, I don't think that's well,
why not?
I guess my point. I guess what I'm getting at is like it's one of those things where in fantasy gaming especially in sort of bog standard D&D fantasy type gaming, it's really easy to like just, to just focus on the adventure, focus on the action, and kind of plow through it. I think it's good advice, though, to like consider the ramifications of your character's actions. I'm not sure that like every player at the table will be into that unless you've talked about it beforehand, but it's an interesting idea for sure.
When I think about situations like that, when I think about how to really facilitate it in any sort of game, and sort of following along with our ideas of, just comparing classic Dungeons and Dragons and style games like that, and how you could even facilitate emotions in games like that, I'm often reminded of, I played a lot of D&D and kind of still do, the paladin problem, where a lot of groups, when you're making an adventuring party, say, well, no one's playing a paladin, right? So we can all have fun. And there's this stigma. There's this stigma against having a paladin in your group, because there's a whole mess of baggage that comes with that sort of character. And a lot of times people steer away from doing that. And oh man, I think no one should ever do that, because the types of options and the types of choices that become available when you have people in your group, in your party, that have different emotions and different goals and different ways to approach problems, that's where emotions exist. You don't want your party to be all just sort of vanilla adventurers that share one common goal and never disagree. You want to encourage diversity and opinions. You want to encourage these different paths that people walk and these different ways of life, so that you can have those instances where maybe an orc is about to be stabbed by your paladin, and yet there is someone else in your party who might be more knowledgeable about the plight of these creatures or something like that. And you have a lot of opportunity in those moments to allow players to, even in really action-heavy games, to allow players to react and to respond to those situations. And I think with a lot of really action-heavy games that are really turn-based, we lose out a lot on the interaction between players in those moments. It's like when you go into a combat, suddenly all of the discussion between the group stops, and you're just focused on rolling dice and moving miniatures for a while. But even there's really no rush to get through it. You can take time, and if something's about to happen, if someone's about to be killed that may have an emotional conflict with the group, you should take that time and say, hey, you, character number 4, or whatever their name would be, this person you see is about to kill this innocent orc. Do you want to say anything? And maybe they don't have time to stop it. Maybe you don't want to break the rules so much to allow intervention, but at least you can allow someone to speak up and ask them to say, hey, don't do that. Hey, please stop. It's not worth it. And then you have an interesting choice. And emotions are spawned from interesting choices at your table. And this person may kill this creature, or they may spare this creature. Either way, the battle is going to continue, but that is an amazing seed of a conversation that's going to happen later. And you as the facilitator can and should circle back to that and say, this member of your party spared the orc. Do you want to talk to them about that? Or this person asked you to stop and grant mercy and you chose not to. Do you want to go and have a conversation about that? Because it seemed like it was sort of intense. And I think that would be an interesting scene to see. And even with those really action-heavy games, you should always look for those opportunities to say, hey, do you want to speak up? Do you want to react in some way emotionally to what's going on? Kind of cycling back to one of your earlier comments, Kate. How do you feel about what's happening right now? And give players that chance to interject, even if only briefly. And then you can use that sort of as a seed to circle back to later and have a longer conversation about it.
It's cool.
I think that's a really great point. I've had that happen actually to me in Dungeon World, where I had a monk who was constantly passive and just stopping people from killing bad guys. And it became a really good role-playing point. So I totally see what you're saying with like having people present the opportunity, maybe don't give them a chance to actually do the conversation then, but to circle back to it a lot. So that's part of, I think, GMing, taking notes about emotions happening, which we don't usually. I usually take notes if I'm running it like a more classic dungeon crawly game about like, they killed this, it's worth this much XP, they killed this treasure is happening, all the many things that happen when you're running a dungeon.
Or even in AW or Monster Hearts, you know, like you're thinking about like the NPC triangles, you're thinking about like, oh, such and such did this at the dance or whatever. Like even in those games, like it's not instinctive to like incorporate emotional like follow-ups and questions into your prep, at least not for me. I mean, not into my prep anyway, for sure.
No, it's not. I don't usually sit there and be like, oh, I'm going to write down this emotion that was noted during this combat so that in 10, 20 minutes when they're at camp, I can be like, hey, so about that thing, how you feeling? That's a great point,
I think that's
Steven.
a really strong reason to just, again, have those conversations. Just mention it before a session at your table. Mention to your players. So then even if you, as the GM, because you're going to have a ton of things that you're keeping in your head, but if you mention to your players, hey, if you feel like there's something you want to have a conversation about or something happens that sort of evokes an emotion in your character that maybe you want to talk through later, just jot it down quick, and that will give us something to do or to talk about during these eventual downtimes.
Well, in the interest of time, shall we move on to the sort of like post-game or even maybe some meta-game like things that might be helpful?
Yeah, let's talk about either post-game or being a player. Is there anything else you guys see at the end of a game that you should be doing?
The end is trickier for me, and the reason why is because I think it's just kind of like where we're at in terms of like the Gauntlets play culture right now, which is we have different streams of thought about like how we should handle the post-game discussion. Some of us really favor Roses and Thorns, right, as a way of like talking about the things they liked and the things they didn't like. I'm not a huge fan of Roses and Thorns, at least as presented, because I kind of feel like it depends a lot on everyone taking the criticism the right way and people delivering the criticism the right way. And I've seen some situations where like things get misinterpreted and it kind of bugs me a little. So as of late, I've mostly just been like interested in kind of the roses, you know, and like talking about what everyone did really well. Importantly, like things that people liked. Now, less than half of my gaming are really like obvious opportunities to have like really intense emotional play. And so it's not something I run into much. But if something happened at the table that, you know, a scene that was really good and chewy and emotional and like really kind of touching, I make sure we bring that up, right? Like I want to get the read at the table and make sure that were the participants like comfortable with it? You know, did you feel comfortable in that moment? B, did you guys like that? Like, is that something we want to keep trying to explore, like that theme? It's just more of the same for me, really, like just kind of keeping those lines of communication open. I don't think I'm not as like sold on like a specific procedure, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I have one question though. When you say, did you feel comfortable in that scene, do you mean did they feel actually comfortable or did they feel safe?
I think what I mean is did they feel safe, right? Like, I think, thank you for clarifying that, because I do think, I think it's okay to have space to feel uncomfortable, like in a role-playing moment. I'm totally into that, right? Like I said, this doesn't come up too often in our games. We play pretty straight down the line, like uncontroversial things, you know, where our play tends to be somewhat uncontroversial. But every now and then when something happens, I just want to make sure that everybody was kind of like cool with it. Does that make sense? You know, like I'm maybe not using the language of like feeling safe, but like just, are you cool with that? And sometimes that's a conversation that happens like away from the table too, right? Like it's something that happens in private, but I'm always interested in checking in and making sure that everyone, you know, even if they just didn't enjoy it, I want to know that, right? Like it may not even be like did you feel like, you know, unsafe, or did you feel like triggered by it, or did you feel like my bullying thing I talked about at the top, like did you have a moment like that? Even just like, are you cool with how it went? You know, like was it satisfying play for you? Mm-hmm. That's also important, I think.
Yeah, I also tend to validate the hell out of people. It's one of my techniques that I use in my professional life because I'm also a person who helps people have babies, and at that moment, a mother is never like, hey, Kate, what am I doing wrong?
Right, yeah.
Right? She's always like, just tell me it's happening and I'm doing good. So I take a lot of my doula principles actually into my gaming principles. And one of that is always tell people what you liked and tell them that they're doing good and thank them for doing good. So if someone's going to do a deep emotional scene at the end of the game, I would be like, hey, Jason, I really want to thank you for being awesome and open and vulnerable there and bringing it to the table. And try to make sure you spread the love so that everyone feels heard and validated and like important.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Because if you say, hey, I'm so glad you're here today, that person immediately is like, oh, she noticed I'm here.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not because I'm important, but because they want to be important. So when you acknowledge their great moments, you're telling people, I want to see more of this. It happens to be how you train dogs. Is with positive reinforcement, where you like ignore the behavior you don't want to see,
right,
and then you really, really jackpot the stuff you do like seeing. I do this with players all the time too, and it doesn't always work, but it does definitely, like, they're like, oh, people really liked it when I was like, not a douche. Great.
Right, yeah,
I'll not douche more.
No, I'm totally with you on the idea of positive, like, a validation. Like, and I do it publicly, right? Like, if somebody really, really knocks it out of the park, like my community hears about it, right? Which is like, which I know, like, the players love. Like, I know they love that. Yeah, that's I think that's super cool advice. Yeah, for sure.
Steven, what do you do after game?
Well, on the note of validation, that's something I actually like to really incorporate during games as much as possible, in addition to doing it after game. Even if a system does not have something inherently built into it as a on-the-spot reward system, I try to do that in basically every game I run. So I got the idea originally from Primetime Adventures. They had the fan mail mechanic, which I adore. And for a lot of games, if I have long campaigns or something like that, I try to incorporate something like that so that I, as the GM, after any kind of emotional scene or any kind of intense role play, I can just give a token to everyone involved and say, that was really cool, guys.
I love those cookies. Oh, man. When in Golden Sky Stories, I want those fucking dreams so bad. Like, I want them so bad. And I, like...
Friendship gems.
It will be the... I will play the cutest, most... like cheek squeezable, adorable thing if you're going to give me some fucking dreams. I want them all. I want all the dreams.
So yeah, I feel like that's very important throughout the game, including after the game. And as a GM, I really try to just make sure that there is time after game. I try to make room for that rather than everyone's just heading out the door and going home. Just having that time and having that time scheduled so that everyone can hang around afterwards and check in together and talk about the session, especially if it's not a group that's going to see each other for another week or two. Having that space for them to discuss and to have sort of a very casual debrief, if not a more structured one, I think is critical for any kind of emotional play you're going to be doing. Because most of the time, and I would even suggest that players really proactively have those discussions with each other after game. You know, make sure that they're validating each other and that they're saying, hey, are you cool? We got really intense during that scene. Like, that's something I would often see players doing for players, and having a GM there who can also sort of facilitate those discussions just in case someone doesn't really feel comfortable broaching them is always good. But just allowing for that time is also really important. Allowing for the discussions, even if it's just everyone chatting and not really talking about the game, it's still okay. We're all de-rolling, we're all resetting back to neutral, and we're going to go away from this having had a positive sort of friendship experience at the end, and kind of have that buffer zone that I think is important.
Yeah, for sure. I recently played a LARP where we had a decompression time afterwards, and it was the first time I've ever seen like scheduled "I still like you" time.
Yep,
that's good. Oh yeah, right. I mean, I think it's super smart. I mean, I experienced that kind of in a LARP too for the first time, and because a LARP tends to get pretty intense, right? At least a lot of them do. At least a lot of the ones I've done. Maybe not See Dracula, but like a lot of the other LARPs do, right? And it was good because sometimes people are really good actors, right? And you don't know how much they are truly feeling something or not feeling something, and so that seems like a good thing. I think there's something applicable there for tabletop too, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So as players, how do you make emotional games happen?
I mean, for most of my experiences as a player in any sort of tabletop game, a lot of that's just about being knowledgeable about the kinds of games I like to play, being knowledgeable about the sort of involvement or interactions I like to have, and just sort of being upfront with people about that. Now, I like to establish as a GM or a player sort of a social contract right from the get-go. And we talked a little bit about setting up expectations and things like that at the beginning of our discussion. But for players, it's just about knowing what you like and being comfortable sharing that, saying, hey, I'm an emo player. I like emotions. Please make me cry. I like to cry, please. Or like, I enjoy occasionally getting heated and having, intense conversations. Are you guys okay with that? Is everyone cool with that if I do that? Just sort of checking in and knowing what you enjoy and trying to make sure that people know about that and people understand that if it sounds like you're getting heated, you're not really. A lot of it just comes down to communication, and no one really knows what kind of gamer you are better than you. So making that known and having conversations about that's really important.
I'm a player infrequently. I 95% of the time I'm GMing a game, but I do, especially if I'm playing with a table I'm not familiar with, like people I'm not familiar with, I like to make sure all the tools are on the table, right? Like make sure the X card's on the table because it's for me, right? Like I consider it like a safety valve for like my own play. It's like I know if it's there and I cross a boundary or somebody's uncomfortable with something or they don't feel safe about something, they can X card it, and I don't take that shit personally. Like I know what it's there for, And I've been in situations and environments where I haven't done that, like in the past, where I haven't made sure, like where I haven't requested a tone conversation, where I haven't requested a content conversation, where I haven't requested an X card, and inevitably someone's expectations get dashed at the table, and so I think as a player, I think that's kind of always like what I'm thinking about, or that's a thing, I think you can do for sure.
One of the things I've been doing lately, and this is actually something I picked up from The Forgotten, which is an Andrew Medeiros LARP game.
I played it, yeah, it's good.
He had what's called
It's a great game.
Isn't it? It's a zombie hack we played because it's not out yet.
Oh, very nice.
But in this, we have what was called the open door policy, where anytime you could leave, you didn't need to explain why. You didn't have to come back. You should if you want to, but it was this way of kind of walking away from the space, gathering yourself for a moment, and then coming back to the on-screen time without having to X-card anything. So it was a way of being like, I'm cool with the content, but dear God, do I just need a minute?
Yeah.
So I've been doing a lot of what I'm calling the X-card experiments lately, where we play without an X-card. On the premise that we are trying to hurt each other as much as possible. And we have what's called the open door policy instead. So we can stop the game and we can walk away, or we can quit. But we cannot X-card content. We're seeing if we can do that with each other and how much we trust each other.
I'd be curious to hear how that goes. That might be a good conversation for the future, right? I mean, sounds like a good topic.
It's my top, like my exploratory thing for this year. It's how safe do I feel with random people?
You're very brave.
I'm trying. But one of the things I have been doing now is an open door policy, where you can totally walk away from the game if you need to, have a minute, and come back, and no one has to address it unless you want them to.
Yeah, I think that across the board, any kind of emotional play you're going to be facilitating, whether you're a GM or a player, making sure that those safety mechanisms are there, is in some cases almost a no-brainer, but it's something that if your GM doesn't mention it, or your GM isn't doing anything like it, kind of like you said, Jason.
It doesn't happen a lot.
Sometimes it's
not infrequent. I mean, it's a thing,
right? Yeah, you would think everyone would totally be on the same page, but sometimes it's maybe your responsibility to kind of step forward and say, hey, can we implement these things?
Yeah.
And having I've played some LARPs with the door is always open door policy. I've played LARPs with safe words like break and cut, to either slow down play or cut play, like, hey, I really like what's happening right now, and please don't stop it, but please maybe don't go further. Things like that. And whatever works for your game, whatever sort of safe words or mechanics you use, as long as there's something there so that players know, and that you know as a player, that there is that safety net in case, so you can push, you can go and fully engage emotionally, and you can go to the limits because you know that that X card or those safe words or that door is there. And if it's too much, other players can rely on it. And then, of course, just not, as Jason mentioned, not taking that seriously. Be able to go in. If you want to be an emotional player or engage with emotional play, understand that sometimes you might get X-carded. You might have someone walk out of the room on you, and that's not against you or your role play necessarily. It's just that's what they're there for.
Yeah,
and that should be able to be embraced without it. Exactly. You can't take it personally.
You just can't. I'm pretty good personally at cabining things off, right? We have a thing in the Gauntlet where it's something we practice in the Gauntlet. We're super serious about it, which is everything we say in an online forum to each other, we're supposed to receive that message in the best way possible, right? Like we're supposed to give it the best reading you could possibly give it, right? And I think I bring that to my play as well, right? Like I know you don't probably mean to be offensive right now. And I also know that you don't mean to be hurting my feelings by calling me out on something or X-carding me or whatever, right? Like, I don't know if that's just, that's maybe not easy. That's maybe not an easy way to be, but.
Well, we do the same thing in Toronto Area Gamers and in Breakout Convention, which is we ask that all people assume best intentions.
Yeah, it's like.
On behalf of other people.
It's just a good way to be, right? It really is.
It is, yeah. I mean, I get X-carded all the time. All the time. All the time, because I am a massage therapist and I have a lot of anatomical knowledge. So when I am describing physical violence, it's descriptive. So I don't know how many times someone's been they look at me panicked and they reach over slowly and then they tap frantically the X card as I just keep going. And I'm like, oh, sorry, their arm is broken.
Right,
it's cool.
Yeah.
And I don't take it personally because I understand my level of interest in something is not everyone's.
Right, yeah.
And I'm more interested in everyone being happy and safe than I am in but I need to describe how his tendons are rolling up into his arm. So, yeah, as a player, it's just being open to being X-carded and being I could fuck this up and I could not. It's cool, right?
Awesome. Well, so Kate, how do you feel? Have we exercised your topic here?
There's one more thing I want to touch on briefly. This actually stems from a conversation I was having with a realtor of Monster Hearts, where I sat down with her when she was here for Fan Expo, and I was like, can you tell me how to make sure Monster Hearts doesn't immediately divulge into violence? Because for me, when you're playing emotional teenagers, it always, at some point, broke into this big fight. And dear God, was it boring, and I was not interested in it. And her response was really evocative, and it's been on my brain. And she was at Fan Expo 4 or 5 years ago. It's been in my head this long. Where she was like, well, when we're feeling really high, intense emotions, we have a habit in role-playing games to default to violence. Because it's an emotional outlet. And I don't understand why that is. I guess because I didn't grow up in a world where I'm like, yeah, violence. Violence is cool. I'm okay when I see violence. Aren't you okay when you see violence? Every time violence has been done to me or I've borne witness to violence, my response isn't I want to go punch something. Yeah. It's, I want to go cry in a room.
Right.
So I think when we're having emotional play, we also need to have a brief conversation about the role of violence in emotion and what does it mean even if you are a paladin who's torturing people to get information out of them, if they've been breaking your holy views on the world? It's been a while since I played paladin.
I think you're describing a Templar, but yeah.
It's Grimworld, right? It's the same thing.
Yeah, a bit more or less.
But what does that violence do to people? And what does it mean when you see your lover kill somebody? What are those emotional things? And why doesn't violence in role-playing games have that kind of emotional gravitas that it would in real life? Why, when we play Monster Hearts, is it okay that the vampire is breaking consent boundaries all the time by just biting people?
Yeah.
So I think when you go into a game and you're doing emotional play, you have to look at the emotionality of violence in and of itself, and what does that mean to you as a player, and what does that mean to your character?
I'll tell you what, I think we've got our topic for next month.
That was what I was actually thinking. As I'm sitting here explaining this, I'm like, this needs to be a bigger conversation.
It does. It's super interesting, and I think it's a bigger conversation.
Sorry.
No, I love it. I think it's awesome. Well, this has been awesome. Do you guys want to go do Giving Me Life?
That sounds good to me.
Great.
All right. This episode of the Gauntlet podcast is being sponsored by our friends at Nocturnal Media. So listeners, I've been thinking a lot about this deal that Nocturnal has put in place with Sigil Stone Publishing. That's Ben Dutter's imprint. What they're going to be doing is making offset print runs of Ben's books, some of his more popular books, available, which is really kind of cool because I don't think they're otherwise easy to get a hold of in physical form. And so I'm pretty pumped about that because a lot of friends of mine in the Gauntlet, particularly in Gauntlet Houston, have played games like Vow of Honor and Belly of the Beast and Hunt the Wicked, and they like them a lot. And so I've been meaning to check them out. Well, so I discovered a really cool thing that I want to tell you guys about. Over on DriveThru, Ben has quick start versions of those games available for free on DriveThru. And I've been downloading them and looking at them because basically I just need to be finally convinced that yes, I want to own physical copies of these books. So go do that. I mean, there's no reason not to. Go check these games out. Ben's got a really, really awesome, design vision that I'm into, and I'm getting pretty excited about it. I can't wait for those physical print runs that Nocturnal's going to be doing. So yeah, go check out the quick starts. They're totally free. We'll have links in the show notes. And thanks again to Nocturnal for sponsoring the show.
Let's do Giving Me Life. What's giving everyone life this week? Steven, you want to go first?
Sure. So, can I do two?
Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't certain. So I have two. I'll try to keep them both sort of moderate length. So the first is, and this kind of gets back to what I talked about at the very top of the episode. I've been playing a new video game. I know, gasp, digital, shocking, called The Witness by Jonathan Blow. And I am super behind the times because this came out a while ago. But it's a puzzle game. And I, as I mentioned before, love puzzles because I love feeling clever. And The Witness has taught me in the time I've been playing it, which has been a amount of hours that I will not fully divulge, that actually I hate all other puzzle games, and I just didn't realize it until I played The Witness. Because what I found with The Witness is that it's unlike a lot of other puzzle games. A very brief kind of overview for any who might not be familiar. In The Witness, with no spoilers included, you're just sort of a person of unknown origin who is on an island suddenly. And the island that you're on doesn't really have anything going on. There aren't people walking around. There's sort of a background story you're never really made privy to, but the only real way you have to engage with the island are through these puzzles. And every single possible puzzle you encounter follows the same basic structure, which is that it's a grid of some kind that you draw a line from one of the beginnings to one of the ends, and you work your line through this puzzle and try and get it through the puzzle in the correct way. So it is a game full of line puzzles, and they're all basically the exact same structure. What happens
horrible.
is you...
Yeah, I know.
My God, it's like, it's so good. It's so good. So what happens? So what happens while you play is the way these puzzles are different is through iconography and symbols and other presentation that will require you to solve the puzzle in different ways. And it sounds incredibly boring, I know, but what happens as you work your way through this game is you begin to sort of learn a language. You begin to uncover piece by piece by piece the vocabulary that assembles these puzzles together, and you learn what these different symbols mean, and you start to assign almost emotional projections onto certain images. Like these two icons don't like each other, and that's how I'll remember I always need to separate them with the line. Or these icons always like to have a friend, and they need to be on the same side of the line. And it's this puzzle language that you learn, and it, more than any other game I've played, sort of constantly riddles you with these aha moments, these very joyful, excited moments when you're able to crack a new concept, a new idea, a new piece of this vocabulary that then you can apply to every other puzzle in the game. As opposed to most puzzle games where Each puzzle is its own standalone challenge, and you have that moment of aha, but then you sort of move on and you'll never address it again. Instead, it's more like you're learning a language and you can apply that to every other thing in the game. And it's a very interesting experience as you just learn more and more as you play it. So, certainly not a game for everyone, but for me, it's been absolutely blowing my mind while I've been playing, because there's a lot of stuff in there that's really, really good. So that's my first one.
I'm so glad it gives you life.
It is. It's definitely not everyone's bag. But if you like puzzle games, oh man, it's good.
You have a puzzle theme tonight. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I have been doing a lot of puzzly things lately for whatever reason. My second one though has nothing to do with puzzles, and I'm starting up a new tabletop campaign for my wife and for my 2 roommates. That's going to be kicking off in a couple days from the time that we're recording. And I'm running it with the new second edition of 7th Sea, which I'm not very familiar with, and I'm sort of learning it as I go. And it's giving me life simply because it is a brand new adventure, and I've been prepping for it for a very long time. So with any campaign, anyone who's ever run a campaign, you sort of get that high from, I've got all of their first sessions mapped out and character sheets are ready, and I bought a little lantern that'll be on the table and a whole little throw that's all nautical themed, and everyone has their own set of dice and all of these other little things that you do or could do when kind of prepping for a brand new adventure. So that's sort of been at the top of my floating at the top of my head for weeks and weeks and weeks now, but it's just about to sort of happen. So that's always exciting whenever you get to start a new adventure.
Super exciting. Jason, what's giving you life?
Mine's pretty brief. So my partner, Rich, is not, this is my life partner, Rich, not my gauntlet partner, Rich, a different Rich. My partner, he is kind of, no, he's really not into geek culture or anything like that. Like he doesn't know. I one time asked him like if he knew who Luke and Leia's father was, and he kind of puzzled out that it was Darth Vader. And when I asked him like, well, do you know who their mother is? And he kind of waited 3 beats thinking, and then he said, Martha Vader? And I said, no. No, not quite.
It's a good guess, though. So many people's mothers are named Martha.
He doesn't know anything about geek culture. He avoids it. He thinks Dungeons and Dragons is so ridiculous. Like we're very different in this way. But I have got him to watch Stranger Things, which is that Netflix program that has lots of genre stuff to it. And he's into it, and we're both enjoying it. It's like this rare, like sort of genre / geek thing that we both enjoy. The only thing is the monster in that is called Demogorgon, and he always refers to it mistakenly as Mega Gordon. So, but baby steps. That's giving me life.
Awesome. So my giving me life is I live in Toronto, and we have what's called the Royal Ontario Museum here. And recently there was an exhibit that closed recently called Chihuly, which is a glass artist. I don't know if anyone's familiar. Yeah. So there was this awesome display at the ROM, it looks like a foreign landscape when you walk in there. There's just this massive amount of glass sculpture everywhere that has like little squids and stuff in it. It was all very sea focused, and it blew my mind. It made me so happy. It reminded me of this weird movie called Light Years from the 80s that is a ridiculous cartoon everyone should go see. It's great if you're not sober. But we then recently, like right after that, we went and saw Nausicaa in the Valley of the Wind, which is a Miyazaki film in the big screen here at TIFF. And those two together, I walked away going, oh my god, I have to run Apocalypse World, because now I have this toxic, jungly, weird Chihuly landscape in my head. And it made me so excited. All of my friends are gamers. We all went and saw it together, like both things. And we walked away and we were like, guys, Apocalypse World.
Nice.
So that was giving me life.
Awesome. Well, this has been super fun. I think this is a really, really successful first stab at our topic roundtables. Stephen, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
What do you have going on right now in terms of like what you're making? Anything you want us to know about?
Pretty much everything that you need to know about my current projects is all going on over on my Patreon right now. I don't have anything. I have a lot of things, I should say, in the works, but I don't have anything new that's out there yet. But a lot of stuff that's really close on the horizon. So if you are interested in the sort of stuff I'm doing or want to see that kind of before it hits the mainstream of conversation, it's patreon.com/Stephen Dewey to see all of my various game projects and kind of get a sneak peek at what's coming up for me.
Awesome. Kate, thanks for prepping this for us. I think it was really successful.
I'm so excited. Thank you for inviting me to do this.
And as always, you can find Kate's writing at Blue Stockings Organic Gaming Blog. It's bluestockings.ca, right?
Yeah, because I'm a Canadian and I'm weird.
Awesome. Listeners, that's our show. If you want to get in touch with us, I recommend going to our website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. We also have communities on G+, and we're on Twitter at GauntletRPG. And if you'd like to support us on Patreon, we would really appreciate that. It's patreon.com/gauntlet. Thanks for listening. Thanks again, guys. And that's our show.
Emotions in gaming a lot. We like to focus on some really interesting aspects like violence, which is strange. But anyways.
I'm going to stop you. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you because I totally forgot to say who Stephen is.
I know, right?
Sorry, it's a new format for me too, so hold on. We rarely have guests. Guests is not, we haven't done guests in ages.